Hello, we are Carlos and Susana, and we are going to expose our final project, which is a comparison of the situation of women writers in the Heian and Edo period. I'm going to start talking about the Heian period and the Salon literature. Women's literature in the Heian period has many differences in relation to literature written by women in other periods. Women belonging to the aristocracy during this period had some advantages regarding writing. It was a time when it was expected that a woman's face would be covered so as not to attract the attention of men. At the same time, the visibility of a woman was also associated with her status. The higher the status, the more beautiful that woman was considered without even having seen her face. It was a historical context in which relationships between men and women were very limited. The only contact they could have was through curtains, fans, or slaves. Therefore, the need to communicate without exceeding the imposed physical limits appeared, so literature began to come to life in the female environment. Poetry became their new communication, since men and women exchanged poems. In this way, writing became a kind of performance, as the calligraphy, the paper they used, and the smell of the poem formed a self-representation. During this period, it was common to have women's salons at court, where ladies in waiting would meet with the ladies of higher status, and it was a space where literary creation was originated. Therefore, women began to have a less victim-like role, as they began to have a voice through writing. Even though women were expected to act in a certain way, they expressed their fears and protests in their literary works. To continue, I'm going to talk about the evolution of writing, from private to public. The fact that women wrote and had their texts read by other women was a way of expressing their resistance and even resignation. When talking about women's literature in the Heian period, writing using kana, which is katakana, onanote, stands out. Kana was used exclusively by women, since women were excluded from any space in which they could demonstrate their knowledge. At the same time, women were prohibited from learning Chinese. The separation of genres in the literary environment is related to its use. Women used kana, while men wrote otokomoji. Chinese was associated with otokomoji writing, which was used for official court documents. Therefore, it was used in the public space. However, the use of kana onanote was related to the private space. However, some women wrote in Chinese, despite being criticized for it, as in the example of Sei Sinagon, and men wrote in kana on some occasions, especially when exchanging poems with women, as it was the most informal way for men and women to socialize. Women had restricted access to some places, and in many cases they only had access to them if they had a male connection. Their main way of rising in society was through marriage. In this way, writing began to play an important role in women's lives, as it was also a means of rising in society. An example of rising in society through writing can be that some women were in the court office translating text from Kambun to kana, which meant that they had to know Chinese. To continue, I'm going to talk about the Nikki genre, which is diary literature. This term is often translated as diary, but is instead understood as a literary genre. Especially Nikki writing by women in the Heian period should not be understood as simply diaries, as many of them are memoirs or autobiographical texts. The literature of the Heian period can be divided into two types: monogatari or narrative and Nikki, separating fictional narrative from autobiographical narrative. However, great authors of the period such as Miner and Mostow claim that the Nikki genre encompasses both monogatari and autobiographical narrative, as well as other genres of the period such as Shu collections, Kasu collections of poems, Ki records, and Miyuki travel records. Initially, Nikkis were records kept by court officials and were written in Kanbun. Their main function was to report special events and court activity, which is why they got this name, since Ni-chi means day and Ki means record. Initially, the main characteristics of these texts were the following: they were written by women, they were written in kana, they included waka, they were time-conscious and realistic, and they had introspective characteristics. However, these initial characteristics are considered too general, since this genre is very difficult to classify, as it has included works from very different categories. Now I'm going to talk about the female authors and the case of Michitsuna no Haha. Women writers were usually members of the nobility and therefore enjoyed certain privileges and benefits related to education, economic resources, and their own spaces for the creation of literature. These women received a privileged education and had access to writing in Ghana, and they also had control over their own time. As they did not belong to the poor classes where women had to make physical efforts to ensure their survival, nor did they belong to the imperial elite where court's obligations interrupt their time to write. They were the luckiest women of the time. They had their own spaces to write, which was an essential aspect for the development of women's literature during that time. I'm going to talk about the case of Michitsuna no Haha. Michitsuna no Haha was born in 935 and belonged to a second-ranking Fujiwara family. Her father, who was the provincial governor, benefited from his daughter's marriage to Fujiwara no Kanei, who was one of the most influential men of the time. This author wrote the work Kagero Nikki, which is considered one of the first examples of Japanese prose written by a woman. In her Nikki, she focuses on criticizing the marriages of the time and dwells on her marriages to Kanei. She is also known for being the mother of Michitsuna, the only son she was able to have with Kanei, which is why she could not fully enjoy the privilege of being his wife. It is thought that she began writing her work in 968, although she actually talks about her life starting in 954, the year she married Kanei when she was 19 and he was 26. At that time, Kanei was the capital of the Right Ward. Kanei had already been married before, so Michitsuna was his second wife. Because she had only been able to give him one son, her situation became more precarious. Her husband took less and less care of her and had relationships with many other women. Therefore, the author used writing to express her feelings about this situation.
Now I'm going to talk about the situation of women writers during the Edo period. This period is situated between the year 1603 with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo, currently Tokyo, and 1868 with the fall of the last shogun and the recovery in a certain way of the role and figure of the Emperor of Japan. This period has been seen in relation to women as the most oppressive in some ways due to several reasons. Popularity and support by the government of Confucianism's argument of women as wives, mothers, and obedient daughters. However, this did not mean that there were no women writers and intellectuals and that the shogunate and regional lords did not support and respect them, since they were seen as potential and active women in the education of their children in the literary production according to the new fashions, an example of the virtuosity of their family, businesswoman, etc. Examples of such women were Arakida Reijo, who devoted herself to fictional historical novels and poems, being one of the few Japanese women historians, talking about her later in depth. Emma Saiko also is a very relevant writer during this period, who stood out during her lifetime for her impulse to calligraphy and poems written in Chinese language, also kanji, where self-reflection, emotionality, biographical aspects are typical of her as well as other authors and authors of that genre, such as Inoue Tsuyo. All of them and many more were daughters of families of medium-sized merchants and samurai or monks who took care to provide them with an education in the Chinese and Japanese classics of the Heian period, both in their homes and especially by sending them to prestigious Confucian schools in Kyoto, Osaka, or Edo, or their adoption by a certain time of important families of samurai and warriors with more resources. While in the Heian period, women of the aristocracy were the main drivers of literacy production and great classics. In the Edo period, a great interest in literacy of all classes was something that increased public schools, patronage, contests, and jobs for new writers. Not surprisingly, there was a proliferation in the last 100 years of the Edo period of some women with high knowledge of Chinese writing and literature becoming Confucian scholars and educators on their own or working in the service of the feudal lord's family who hired them, as well as the proliferation of more genres such as travel guides, different styles of poems, historical, mythical, adventures books, discourse and philosophical books, encompassing official or intellectual literature and the more popular view. Taking these examples into account, it is worth asking how the Edo period has been seen as a time without women, writers, and participants in the literary and intellectual production of the country until very recently. This brings us not so much to the time in which they lived, in which they were recognized and respected for their qualities, virtues, wisdom, and work, although they faced some criticism for wanting to exceed their limits and those of their male colleagues, but to the subsequent historiography during the Meiji period, which comes from the 1868 until the 1912. In that period, in the work to write a national history of the country, like those in Western countries that Japan took as an example for its development, in the literary field, many authors took reference to the Heian period and its authors as the prototype of women writers and their works. Thus is, they wanted to leave behind the recent period, the Tokugawa period in many of its forms, to start a more modern and liberal one in a way, breaking with part of their previous culture, thus relating the Tokugawa period and the dominance of that family to the oppression of women and their unexpected struggle to achieve it, supposedly breaking their chains already with the beginning of the Meiji period when women writers gained some national and international prestige, their involvement in political and intellectual movements, or the opening of colleges for women. However, this period of liberation contradicts itself because, for example, in the role they want to give to the woman writer, it is that of an education woman but a stay-at-home mother, when in the Edo period no criticism of her status as a single or divorced woman had a negative influence on her work. Examples are Saiko, Saigon, Seiko, and Kakei, who never married, or Bumpo and Unpo, who were divorced. Another clear argument is that the fact of taking as a basis the literature of the Heian period is due to wanting to use those genres that proliferate among the women of the aristocracy, quasi-autobiographical narratives and lyric poetry, leaving aside in the study of the Edo period other genres affecting both male and female authors. Kansei writers were badly affected, for example, since during the Meiji period, even if there were courses in schools and universities of Chinese language and literature aimed at women, then in real life they were seen as unfeminine and arrogant people. Since in the genres and works where women proliferate in the Heian period, the national essence of Japan is some. In other words, the writing in hiragana is based on Japanese pronunciation and speech and is written from Chinese characters that, along with sentimentality, emotionality, the strong ability to influence the reader through them, the letting go or sensualism in a certain way, which leads us to aspects such as nativism and femininity, respectively. In the Heian period, works in Chinese, Waka, Kuban were written by men as well as other genres. The government during the Meiji period and onwards wanted to project a submissive vision of women as a pillar of the Japanese national essence and virtues, although offering her educational opportunities and a few more job opportunities. This new capitalist society wanted to separate itself from the supposed Confucianist society of the Tokugawa, and that is quite distant from the rational, complex works of authors of novels like Reijo or the writings of great Chinese influence to be written in that language or by using Chinese arguments of Suyo, for example. Now I would like to delve more deeply into the lives of a key woman in the Edo period and her work previously mentioned at the beginning of this part, being able to value and give more recognition to her work. As already mentioned, Arakida Reijo lived between 1732 until 1806. She was born inside the Ise Shrine near Matsusaka and in Nagoya. Her parents were priests of the inner shrine. Her family background was not related to the imperial court or guild warriors, although her family was privileged to be members of the Japanese religious community and above the largest and most important Shinto temple in the country. However, her parents were not very optimistic about giving their daughter much education, but the help of her male siblings was indispensable in her later knowledge of Chinese and Japanese, causing her to be adopted and tutored by several teachers such as Emura Hokai or Satomura Soteki from the age of 17. Through these initial years, it could be glimpsed that Reio's strong point was the Chinese language or joint poetry, or rewa, which is written by several authors, which hints at her ability to construct and relate various paragraphs in a logical and rational order and structure. This would be of great use to her in later narrative works, both fictional and historical. For example, Suki no Yukue, which can be translated as Where Does the Moon Go? Out the Genpei Wars at the end of the Heian period shows her interest in both the discipline of history and storytelling, also reflected in her comments and summaries of her narrative work Utsubo Monogatari, late 12th century. Also, her husband, Yoshishige Ietada, also greatly encouraged and supported his wife in her work as a professional writer of fiction and history, in the sense that he provided her with numerous Japanese and Chinese material resources from the East Shrine Library for her works.
Here is the bibliography that we have used for the project. And thank you so much for your attention. We hope you like it.